I hope the Pacific is as blue as it has been in my dreams. I hope.
Shawshank Redemption is often regarded as one of the best films of all time, managing to bridge the perfect balance between the artistic and the entertaining to make it a favourite for both those types of audiences. You'd be hard pressed not only to find anybody who doesn't like the movie, but anybody who wouldn't rank it as one of their favourites, as I definitely would. Obviously there will be spoilers on the off chance any of you haven't already seen this juggernaut of a film. That's your warning. And thinking spoiler wise, if I try to think back to the first time I watched this film, the ending came with a twist that technically should have been entirely predictable. This is a prison film. Every prison film in existence involves prisoners escaping from prison, and yet this movie functions perfectly to make Andy's escape come as a surprise. Not as a great shock, admittedly. I mean, it makes sense. No one would have said it was completely unexpected, but it is still a twist. Which I'm highlighting not just because it's clever storytelling, how to make the expected outcome end up like a twist, which they do well, technically, through things like the rock hammer being introduced with the idea of escape as a complete joke.
I finally got the joke. It will take a man about 600 years to tunnel under the wall with one of these.
And the fact the story is told from Red's viewpoint and Andy is naturally a bit of a closed book means he can hide secrets from the audience easily without us being suspicious. But the big reason it's able to function as a twist is also sort of the greater emotional point behind it all. It's a twist that underpins the main thematic point of the film. More than anything, this is a story about hope and how it's a
terrible thing to live in fear.
I mean, this isn't a story about escape at all until the end of the film. No one ever really talks about it. Nobody seems to try escaping Shawshank, but instead we see the reverse. Brooks threatening to kill Hayward so that he doesn't have to leave at the end of his sentence, so that he can stay in prison. We're given one of the most heartbreaking sequences in cinema, where the idea of outside life, the very dream of a prisoner, what should be the most beautiful good thing of all, becomes so frightening as to turn away from it. This isn't a story about escape because the spirits have become too broken to even want that. First with Brooks, then slowly with Red, who is the one able to explain Brooks' feelings and being
institutionalized
with great empathy, whose character arc at first seems to be a parallel of Brooks, where he considers hope to be
a dangerous thing. Better get used to that idea. Like Brooks did.
Which is why it is so thematically important that we as the audience kind of forget about escape in this film. Because when you think about escape, and not just in terms of prison, but escaping an addiction, an abusive relationship, a rut in your life, a state of feeling, whatever it is, it doesn't just come down to that practical dilemma of how to actually get away, the technical aspects of like digging the tunnel and when to make a break for it, how to avoid the cards kind of stuff. What it also comes down to is that emotional, tumultuous battle between hope and fear. Can you maintain belief in this better world? Can you really trust that it's worth the risk, that things will be better in that very distant and unfamiliar outside world? Or do you fear it too greatly? You know, when you've become used to alcohol or whatever as the thing that makes you feel better, can you believe that you can function happily without it? That beyond that initial stage of withdrawal you will adjust, or that turning away from the partner who hurts you or makes you feel miserable, that there will be greater happiness beyond that initial pit of loneliness you feel in their absence. And so it's the emotion of that struggle that the film functions perfectly to express. Hope isn't just beautiful but incredibly fragile. Whilst Red is right to say it's a terrible thing to live in fear, it's also very hard not to, at many times in our lives. What we witness across the majority of this film is the gradual decaying of a community's spirits, until even Andy, who has served as a beacon and reminder of hope in the Shawshank prison, starts to look broken. Where we begin to fear he's finally gone the same route as Brooks, the same route Red seems to be travelling. Which begins mostly with the death of Tommy, who, if hope was a motif in this film, Tommy would certainly be part of it. The young, energetic, eager for life kid.
Hey, come on, old boys! Move it like molasses! Making me look bad!
Tommy represents potential for the future as this thief who has been in and out of prisons for years, now finally looking to change. Not just thinking about it, but incredibly driven, seen through the example of his determination to pass exams despite the fact he barely knew how to read in the beginning. He represents the hope of a future generation, the hope that criminals can be reformed, that people can do better, that people at a great disadvantage, so much as even being illiterate, can grow and achieve. And in fact, I think his story of the exam is a bit like a mini fable about this hope versus fear struggle, where he becomes so convinced he's done badly and will fail the exam that he screws up his paper and throws it away, afraid to see his imagined failure printed in a grade. Whereas Andy maintains hope and mails the paper anyway, to the revelation then that Tommy did actually pass. His fears were wrong, you know? How easily our fears can limit our capacity to grow or do good things. But this hope Tommy represents is then destroyed in his murder at the hands of the warden. It's a three-way death of hope in this film, however. Firstly, because it's the loss of this good man being killed. Secondly, because it's the loss of Andy's one chance to prove his innocence, since Tommy could stand as witness, and thirdly, because it leads to the warden turning nasty to Andy and putting him through 2 months of solitary confinement, which is just horrendous. Solitary confinement for extended periods, especially like that, is just torture, really. All of it appears to finally break Andy, and we get a long scene where he talks about his pain and the sense of injustice to Red, who even remarks with concern to his friends that Andy's
talking funny. I'm really worried about him.
And so when Hayward mentions that Andy asked him for a length of rope, we believe Andy's fate will parallel Brooks now. That Shawshank has finally broken him as it has so many others. The entire arc of the movie kind of leads towards this knife point. And we get a shot of Andy silent in his cell, holding the rope. The cell split between light and dark on either side of him, emphasising this knife point between hope and fear even more so, between a rope for a noose or a rope to help his escape. We're led to consider that Andy might commit suicide precisely because it is a very real possibility. It would take very little for that last thread of hope to snap, and so in that sense it does ultimately come down to the very thin line of
get busy living, you get busy dying.
So yeah, whilst on the one hand it's not an unexpected twist, I think we do imagine some escape of sorts to happen, and it would be a very unsatisfying film if Andy did just hang himself here, but emotionally a very plausible plot point, whereas escape is realistically the more surprising outcome. Maintaining hope is one hell of a task in anybody's life. Shawshank Redemption serves to emphasise that point to us very clearly. Which feels like a concluded place to finish this video, but there's still a lot of other stuff I want to say about this film. One being how to maintain hope when it is understandably very difficult. I think the film makes a few points on that too, although I feel like there's probably more to say than I'm noticing here. The obvious being through the experience of beauty. Andy spends 19 years in Shawshank Prison, most of which is an ongoing collection of bad experiences and time stretching out into this agonising, empty treadmill of an existence. I like how directorially, how seamlessly everything transitions in this film to make 19 years pass like a timeless blink. Even through the way Red's narration sometimes melds into the dialogue.
The powers that be decided that
the roof of the license plate factory needs resurfacing.
This is a place where bad experiences do 100% outweigh the good. Unquestionably so. And I think this tendency we have as humans to weigh up and compare good against bad in life as though to try and find some clear answer as to whether or not life is a good thing. I think that's something I've talked about at times in the past, but here I just wanted to point out the power of beauty, even in the small and very sparse moments, because within this unending, bleak existence of Shawshank Prison, we get one or two beautiful experiences. The beers on the roof, my god, in terms of just how vivid it is, that's a scene I find one of the most beautiful in any film, really.
we sat and drank with the sun on our shoulders and felt like free men. Hell, we could have been tarring the roof of one of our own houses. We were the lords of all creation.
How this one brief moment seems to soar up far above the rest of the desolation. How even the smallest experiences of beauty can be enough to maintain hope, or at least bolster your spirit once more against the burdens it has to carry. The same can be said for the scene with Andy playing Mozart.
It was like some beautiful bird flapped into our drab little cage and made those walls dissolve away.
The power of its beauty is so great that the few minutes of music makes the 2 weeks in the hole that follows.
Easiest time I ever did.
There are just some experiences we have, for whatever reason, that feel like beauty beyond all ordinary existence and that are worth just cherishing forever. One I have is from when I was about 13 at school waiting for the bus home on a sunny day under a conker tree, and a group of us, for some reason, playing this game of trying to throw conkers so they curved round this turn in the road, and all the while listening to Three Little Birds by Bob Marley on repeat that one of us had on their Motorola Razr flip phones. I don't know what made that experience so perfect or why it sticks in my mind like that, but Red is absolutely right. We felt like the lords of all creation, and whenever I hear that song, I think back to that moment. In addition to that though, the film is permeated with lots of metaphors for kind of having the grit to really work at things. The idea of Andy continuously sending one letter a week asking for funds to build a library until he does finally get them. Or the idea...
Geology is the study of pressure and time. That's all it takes, really. Pressure and time.
Which on its own does stand for that general idea of working hard in life to achieve things, but I think it's particularly the fact this grit often comes alongside a kind of tenacity or sense of clear direction to what you're working at. Because Andy isn't the obedient, good, hard worker. He's a man who pushes at the system by mailing these letters when he's not supposed to, by having a clear vision for this library and creatively stretching funds with donations and charity books to manage it. That's about really pushing at the world around him in a clever way. Pressure and time, but not too much pressure that it reacts back against him or gets him in trouble kind of thing. I think that makes sense. And the tenacity to have approached Hadley with the offer to act as his lawyer in return for beers. The risk to have secretly tunnelled at the wall for 19 years, knowing what would have happened if he was caught, to risk switching and taking records so that he could both empty out the warden's funds to himself, whilst also providing evidence for his crime to send him down. That's more than just work hard and the world will reward you, which we know it often doesn't. Otherwise Andy would never have ended up in a prison to begin with, you know? It's work hard, but fighting for what he's owed. Andy has to put up a hell of a fight in this film, but without seeking petty revenge against the world, I'd say. Fighting with hope and not bitterness. I suppose the clearest metaphor for all of it is Andy as a man
who crawled through a river of shit and came out clean on the other side.
Also, when I say it took him vision, think Andy using his position as prison guard lawyer to secure funds for expanding the library, and another prisoner remarking,
Gonna ask for something, ask for a pool table.
Which at face value we'd all probably rather pick over a library, but how much more of a meaningful difference the library makes and the self-improvement it offers. It takes vision to recognise that. So, other points. I think Red doing a voice-over narration for this film is perfect. Voice-over narration is the sort of thing that's often seen as lazy and bland in movies as a form of storytelling, but this is the exact kind of film where it fits. Also, Red doesn't actually spout much exposition at all in the voiceovers. He's mainly just cementing some of the themes or Andy's feelings, or his opinion on Andy's feelings. I think we could follow the plot pretty much fine with the narration muted, so I think that helps it not feel as lazy. Instead, we get this incredibly poetic narration. So many of Red's voiceover lines are just fantastic writing.
Old life blown away in the blink of an eye. Nothing left but all the time in the world to think about it.
It's important because Andy is this slightly closed off, almost mystical character, so telling events from Red's viewpoint, informed by his feelings and interpretations about his friend, enhances this. It's like the Sherlock told through the lens of Watson type thing. And obviously, like I hinted earlier, having a voiceover makes it easier for the passing of time to merge so that the 19 years go by without any obvious shifts. I think Andy is a fascinating character in terms of how subdued he is, to the extent he believes it's his inability to really express passion that led to his wife having an affair. and subdued to the extent the court interprets him as being very icy and sinister, and to the extent it takes him ages to really open his mouth to talk to anyone at Shawshank. Part of that last one is obviously kind of protecting himself in this prison environment, keeping everything within, including his sense of hope in a way, perhaps shielding it, but this is a man who could be absolutely furious at his situation and the injustice of it. Also perhaps furious at himself out of guilt. When he found out about his wife's affair, Andy got drunk and stumbled over to the golf pro's home with a revolver to shoot them. I mean, he obviously wasn't going to go through with it, he sobered up and came to his senses, but on some level the desire or fantasy of murdering them was there. One he might have felt bad about having come the morning. However, when they do actually then get murdered, even if it wasn't him, it brings home the reality of what that little part of him was wishing for, perhaps unconsciously making him feel like it was this wish he had that then caused it to literally happen. We know he must feel some guilt simply from the fact he gave up drinking after that.
Want a cold one, Andy?
No thanks. Gave up drinking.
Instead, however, all this anger stifles into his naturally already subdued manner, but it is always there, and I think he'd probably get some release through the delight he must feel at getting one over on the wardens or guards in all the little ways he does manage. Having a cell search and the warden even taking Andy's Bible briefly, all the while knowing there's a tunnel hidden behind the poster and a rock hammer hidden in the Bible. The thrill of that. One of the other obvious things this film is about is the prison system itself. A film set in the 40s, 50s, 60s era, made in the 90s, about a prison system that still bears resemblance to today. That's quite sad. Obviously we see corruption, brutality, dehumanising prisoners, profiting off their labour, as America still does to horrendous extremes. I think American prisons make up like a fifth of prisoners across the entire world as well. I'll have to check that. It's the idea of rehabilitation though. Our introduction to Red is through a parole hearing with them asking if he feels he's been rehabilitated. We see it happening 3 times throughout this film, asking the same question despite Red seeing it as
a made-up word, a politician's word, so that young fellas like yourself can wear a suit and a tie and have a job.
And yet what about Shawshank Prison has functioned to rehabilitate anyone into society? More likely to alienate them from it, so much so that Tommy as a kid eager to get somewhere in life is the rarity, the exception to the rule. And even his drive, having already been in and out of most prisons in the state, comes through the library that Andy has to fight to get built, and through Andy's own passion to teach him, not from the prison system itself. I mean, prisons are supposed to have 2 functions really, I suppose. One is obviously to keep the public safe by keeping dangerous people away, and Shawshank does obviously achieve that. But the other function is to also reform them so that when they return to society they're less likely to break the law again. There's the idea that by punishing them and giving them a long hard time to reflect on their actions, they'll just naturally learn and change. Except the joke in this film is that nobody reflects on their crimes because everybody in Shawshank argues they're innocent. They resist any reflection altogether because, of course you would, you're already being treated like an animal. You don't want to feel even worse about yourself, throw a bunch of criminals together, treat them like dirt, and then somehow expect them to believe in the possibility of change? How are they supposed to maintain the hope of goodness within themselves, the potential to achieve, the idea that they could be better? Which is already hard for all of us anyway in general life, let alone when you're being treated like scum. It takes the extraordinary strength of Andy to maintain belief in himself. It takes the strength of him to spread that to other people, but even then, all that seems to keep Red from veering away is
a promise I made to Andy.
The environment they then put into, the treatment, and also the social pressures of society looking down on you, or the people you know back home perhaps expecting you to return to crime. All of that does just make change incredibly difficult. It's the same emotional struggle really as this one of escape from Shawshank Prison. It's a tremendous undertaking. So when Red is asked if he's been rehabilitated, Red says,
I don't have any idea what that means.
Because either rehabilitation is not the point of prison and it's all about revenge and punishment against this sect of society we can freely look down on as bad people, or else it's hypocritical to talk about rehabilitation, and perhaps all of that does simplify things a bit, but it is largely the argument of this film that prisons expect rehabilitation without providing or teaching it. And it is, of course, set a good 70 odd years ago, and I do think a lot has improved since then, but I'd also argue not enough. The great point, however, is of course still hope. In spite of this backwards prison of Shawshank, and in many ways hope isn't the deepest, most artistic of themes. I don't think I've said anything about it here that's like groundbreaking or whatever, but I don't think it matters. Hope is a universal theme for a film, one that touches everybody's heart very closely, because we all, in our own ways and with our own scale, understand that struggle between hope and fear, between getting busy living or busy dying. This film is so loved because it touches everybody's heart and does it through a setting and a story that can talk about hope without it being forced or contrived, and without being wishy-washy all optimism, because this does still show the harshness of prison and provides down-to-earth appeal and humour through the ordinary prison characters around Andy, so in that sense it's meaningful, moving and entertaining all at once. It's also probably about time I read the book. Anyway, that's basically everything I wanted to say about Shawshank Redemption. Let me know what you think. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe, support me on Patreon if you fancy, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And a big thank you goes to Devin, David Kling, Darren Brotherglatter, Kestrel, Arwen, Stephen Legg, Samara Salsi, Sharikoff2814, Joshua C. Follier, Chad Bramwell, and Incomplete Sentience. Thank you.